Paris, October 21st, 1789. A baker named Denis Francois is standing in his shop when an angry crowd bursts through the door. They're accusing him of hoarding flour, of deliberately keeping bread prices high while people starve. He protests. He shows them his stockroom. There's no hidden flour. His prices are what the market demands, what he needs to charge just to stay in business. It doesn't matter. Within minutes, Denis Francois is dragged into the street and beaten to death. His body is mutilated, and his head is paraded through Paris on a pike. His crime? Being a baker during the French Revolution. Welcome to 1789, where baking bread became one of the most dangerous professions in France. Not because of ovens or working conditions, but because starving people needed someone to blame, and bakers were right there, visible, tangible targets for rage that had been building for decades. This isn't about the nobility or the guillotine or grand political movements. This is about the people caught in between. The shopkeepers who became scapegoats for an economic crisis they didn't create and couldn't control. So what really caused the bread shortage that sparked revolution? Why did ordinary people turn on their neighbourhood bakers with such violence? And what does this have to do with a quote Marie Antoinette never said? Let's step into revolutionary Paris. The year is 1788. The harvest has failed, and being a baker means choosing between bankruptcy and murder. The French Revolution didn't start because people suddenly decided monarchy was bad. It started because people were hungry, really, really hungry, and bread was everything. For the average Parisian in 1789, bread accounted for roughly 50% of household expenses in good times. In bad times, up to 88%. Bread wasn't a side dish, bread was the meal. Everything else was supplementary, if you could afford it at all. Now let's talk about 1788, because this is where everything goes wrong at once. First, a drought in spring damages crops. Then in July, a massive hailstorm destroys what survived. The harvest is catastrophic, one of the worst of the century. But wait, it gets worse. The winter of 1788-89 is brutally cold. The Seine freezes solid. Mills can't grind grain because water wheels are locked in ice. Transportation stops because rivers are frozen and roads are impassable. Even if grain existed somewhere, you couldn't move it. Bread prices start climbing. In August 1788, a £4 loaf costs 8 sous. By February 1789, it's 14.5 sous. By July, it hits 16 sous. The average worker earned maybe 20-30 sous per day and had to feed an entire family. People were spending literally everything on bread, with nothing left for rent, firewood, clothing or other food. And when bread prices consume all your income, you can't buy anything else. Which means other industries collapse. Which means unemployment rises. Which means even fewer people can afford bread. It's a death spiral. The government tries importing grain, regulating prices, assuring everyone there's enough. Nobody believes them. And honestly, they're right not to, because the shortage is exactly as bad as people think, possibly worse. By summer 1789, Paris is a powder keg. Everyone is hungry, everyone is angry, and everyone is looking for someone to blame. Enter the bakers. October 5th, 1789. 3 months after the Bastille, nothing has improved. Bread is scarcer and more expensive than ever. The revolutionary government is busy arguing about political theory while people starve. And the women of Paris have had enough. It starts at the markets. Women gathering every morning looking for bread find either none available or prices beyond reach. The market women, fishwives, laundresses, workers, are responsible for feeding their families and they're watching their children go hungry. Someone starts beating a drum. More women join. Within hours, thousands are marching through Paris in the rain, armed with whatever they can find. Kitchen knives, pikes, pitchforks, clubs. They're not marching to bakeries though, they're marching to Versailles. The demand is simple. Bring the king to Paris where he can see what's happening, and bring the royal grain stores where they can actually feed people. This isn't planned revolutionary action. This is spontaneous eruption of women tired of watching their families starve, while the royal family lives in luxury 12 miles away. The march is led, organised and sustained by women, though men eventually join, including National Guard units. They march 12 miles in the rain. At Versailles, they force their way into the palace. The confrontation is tense, chaotic, occasionally violent. There are negotiations, there are threats. There's actual combat when some marchers try to reach the Queen's chambers. By October 6th, the king agrees. He and his family return to Paris, escorted by a crowd that swelled to perhaps 60,000 people. The crowd carries loaves of bread on their pikes, bread found in royal stores, chanting, "We're bringing back the baker's wife and the baker's boy." The king as baker. It's both metaphor and accusation. You're supposed to provide for your people, and you've failed. The Women's March is one of the revolution's most significant events, triggered entirely by bread shortage, not abstract political philosophy. Bread. Quick question. Could you have survived revolutionary France? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into the darker side of food history, subscribe me. We've got more stories about when feeding people went horribly wrong. Now back to the bakers who weren't lucky enough to be royalty. Let's return to Denis Francois. His death wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern of violence against bakers throughout 1789. Francois was a master baker in Saint-Antoine, a working-class neighbourhood where shortage hit hardest. That October morning, a crowd demanded bread. He had some, but not enough for everyone, and his prices reflected the actual cost of grain, which was astronomical. The crowd accused him of hoarding. This was standard. Bakers must be hiding flour, deliberately creating scarcity to drive up prices. Never mind that this made no economic sense. If you're a baker with flour, you want to bake and sell it immediately, because that's how you make money. Hoarding flour during bread riots is the business strategy of someone with a death wish. But economic logic doesn't matter when people are starving and scared. Francois showed them his stockroom. He showed his accounts. No hidden flour. The crowd didn't care. They dragged him into the street, beat him to death, mutilated his body, and paraded his head through Paris as a warning to other bakers. The revolutionary government condemned the murder publicly, but did little to prosecute anyone. Some members suggested that while violence was regrettable, perhaps it would teach bakers to be more civic-minded about pricing. This is victim blaming taken to its logical extreme. But here's where the government made everything worse: price controls. In May 1793, the National Convention passed the law of the maximum, setting maximum prices for grain and bread. The logic seemed sound. Bread is too expensive, so make high prices illegal. Problem solved, right? Wrong. So very wrong. Let's do the math. Grain costs X. You're legally required to sell bread for Y, but Y is less than what it costs to buy grain, pay workers, heat ovens, and keep your shop running. You're legally mandated to lose money on every loaf, so bakers stopped baking, or baked much less, or saved flour for the black market where they could charge actual prices and maybe survive. The government made hoarding a crime punishable by death. Bakers were supposed to acquire grain, bake it immediately, sell it at a loss, and somehow stay in business. This is not how economics works. This is not how anything works. The bread shortage, which was bad before, became catastrophic. Price controls, because nothing says we're helping, like making the problem worse and guillotining people for noticing. Revolutionary France ran on rumours, and these rumours were deadly. The most persistent was the famine plot, the belief that aristocracy, clergy, or foreign powers were deliberately creating bread shortages to undermine the revolution. They were supposedly hoarding grain, paying bakers to withhold bread, bribing farmers not to sell crops. Was this true? No. Well, mostly no. There were isolated cases of hoarding, but nothing resembling the vast conspiracy people believed in. But conspiracy theories during crises are emotionally satisfying. It's easier to believe evil people are deliberately causing your suffering than to accept that sometimes weather is bad, harvests fail, and complex systems collapse. Conspiracy gives you villains to fight. Random chance just gives you despair. This paranoia led to home invasions. Revolutionary committees searched residences for hoarded food. If they found more than a few days' worth of flour, perfectly normal for a household avoiding daily shopping during crisis, you could face the guillotine. Bakers couldn't win. Too much flour? Hoarding? Too little. Part of the conspiracy. Raised prices? Profiteering? Closed shop? Sabotaging the revolution. And speaking of things that weren't true, let them eat cake. We need to talk about this phrase because most people assume Marie Antoinette said it. She didn't. Not once. Not ever. The phrase "qu'il mange de la brioche" appears in Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765 when Marie Antoinette was 9 years old and living in Austria. Rousseau attributes it to a great princess but doesn't name her. Most historians think he made it up or was referencing an old folk tale. The phrase wasn't connected to Marie Antoinette until decades after the revolution, when it became useful propaganda. But the myth persists because it feels true. It captures the disconnect between aristocracy and starving population. Whether any princess said those words, the sentiment, aristocratic obliviousness to what bread shortage meant, was real. The let them eat cake myth is the perfect example of how revolutionary France operated. Facts mattered less than narrative. Truth mattered less than useful propaganda. The bakers died because people needed someone to blame. Marie Antoinette's reputation died for the same reason, and that fake quote outlasted both of them. Before we wrap up, what other historical food crises should I cover? The Irish potato famine? Soviet bread lines? Drop suggestions in the comments. And if this made you think differently about the French Revolution, hit subscribe. Now let's bring this home. The terror eventually ended in July 1794. Price controls were repealed by December, and slowly, painfully, France's food supply began to stabilise, not because of government intervention, but because markets were finally allowed to function and harvests improved. But the damage was done. Hundreds of bakers had fled or been killed. The infrastructure of food production had been damaged by years of price controls, paranoia, and violence. Trust between bakers and communities, built over generations, was destroyed. The French Revolution changed the world. Modern democracy, human rights, secular government, these ideas were forged in revolutionary France. But they were forged at tremendous human cost, and not just the aristocrats who lost their heads. Also lost were the ordinary people caught in the middle, the shopkeepers trying to survive an economic catastrophe while being blamed for causing it. The bakers murdered for charging market prices during famine. The farmers who stopped bringing grain to cities because it wasn't safe. Denis Francois died because people needed a villain, and he was convenient. He died because paranoia and hunger are toxic. He died because it's easier to blame the person selling expensive bread than to confront the complex web of agricultural failure, climate disaster, and political upheaval that created the shortage. So tonight, when you buy bread, without fearing for your life or the bakers, remember the people who weren't so lucky. Remember that sometimes the revolutionary mob and the thing they're revolting against are both wrong, and the people who suffer most are the ones just trying to survive. Thanks for watching, and maybe appreciate your baker. They're no longer risking decapitation, but they're still up at 3 a.m. making your breakfast.